Welcome back to Florida Realtors Live. This is our last interview of the conference. I'm Tracy Velt. I'm your host. I am a contributing editor with Florida Realtor Magazine and a managing editor at HousingWire and host of the Real Trending podcast. I have on the stage with me Ben Schachter. He is the broker president. I just said that wrong, didn't I?
No, you
Schachter.
said
okay.
Perfect.
Broker president of the Signature Real Estate Companies, and we are going to talk about Addendum FF. Thanks for joining me.
Thank you, Tracy. I'm thrilled to be here. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, so we'll just start with the basics. What is Rider FF, and what problem was it designed to solve?
Rider FF is an addendum that can be used with the FAR purchase contract. And it's a really misunderstood rider that is so important. And one of the reasons it's important is it can dictate your income.
That's important.
Customers write their purchase contracts, and they're focused, of course, on the property.
Yeah.
The buyer wants to get the property of their dreams, and their seller is trying to sell the property for top dollar.
Right.
Addendum FF, also referred to as Rider FF, is a document that can be included in a purchase contract that stipulates that the buyer's agent and the buyer, prior to writing the purchase contract, have already entered into a pre-negotiated buyer brokerage representation agreement.
Okay.
And in that buyer brokerage representation agreement, that is not part of the purchase contract, the buyer has agreed to compensate their buyer's broker in a particular dollar amount and a particular percentage.
Okay.
When Rider FF is used, the buyer is making their offer to the seller contingent on the seller giving the buyer a credit in an amount, either a dollar or a percentage, that will satisfy the buyer's obligation outside the purchase contract to compensate their realtor. So, for example, it's very commonplace that a buyer's agent and a buyer will look at a property and the buyer will say, I want my offer contingent on a new dishwasher.
Yeah.
I want my offer contingent upon cutting down the shrubs in the backyard. So the buyer's agent will enter those terms into the purchase contract. It's a contingency. The buyer-broker agreement is outside the purchase contract. It predates the purchase contract. It exists before the purchase contract. And when you use Rider FF, the buyer and the buyer's agent are telling the listing agent and the seller, this purchase offer we are making is conditioned upon you, the seller, satisfying the buyer's obligation to pay their agent. So yes, I want the dishwasher replaced, and yes, I want the hedges trimmed back, but I also want you to pay my buyer commission that is in my pre-existing buyer-broker agreement.
So many agents think of it as like just a compensation form, but it's really a contract rider. So what is the distinction, and why does that matter so much?
Compensation agreements live and exist outside of purchase contracts. Many agents make the fatal mistake of trying to include or embed compensation agreements with purchase contracts. They are unrelated. Realtors have to remember that purchase contracts are between buyers and sellers. They are not between realtors and their customers. So when you have a compensation agreement, that is an agreement between a buyer's broker and either the seller of the property that is paying the buyer's broker in a decoupled scenario. They're paying that commission over their listing agent's head directly to the buyer or buyer's broker, or in a coupled scenario where the listing agent is compensating the buyer broker through a compensation agreement. Compensation agreements are independently negotiated outside of purchase contracts. Purchase contracts should not be conditioned upon compensation agreements. If you want your purchase contract tied to a compensation amount or percentage, you either have to rely upon Rider FF or GG, and even those are wildly different. In today's discussion, FF is particularly important because NAR told us on August 17, 2024 that we have to negotiate commissions. What better opportunity to do that as part of the purchase contract through a credit or exchange of dollars that ultimately will reflect on the HUD statement.
Yeah, absolutely. And so when should the agent use it? Like when, and when should they not use it? Can you walk us through maybe some real world scenarios?
Absolutely. There's a critical time to use it. There's a time you should never use it, and then there's an optional time to use it. The critical time to use it is when there is no compensation agreement in place between the buyer's broker and the opposing seller or listing broker. When you don't have that in place, it is critically important because if you don't use that, you're then leaning back and relying upon the pre-existing buyer-broker agreement where you're having your buyer pay you, the buyer's broker, your entire commission.
Yeah.
So when you don't have a compensation agreement, I recommend, and I teach my agents, to always use Rider FF to accompany and be part of the purchase contract. Don't forget, on page 1213 of the purchase contract, we have to select all the riders, make sure you check off that FF is included. Then it has to be used. When you don't have to use it. You don't have to use it when you have a pre-existing compensation agreement. If the buyer's broker and the listing broker have already negotiated a compensation agreement, either in a decoupled or a coupled fashion, coupled being where the listing agent is paying the buyer broker, decoupled where the seller is paying the buyer broker, then you don't need Rider FF necessarily, because you already have established and you have a written document controlling your compensation if that transaction comes to fruition.
Okay.
Optional. Perhaps you want a combination or a hybrid scenario. You have a buyer-broker agreement, which you must have on every transaction before you show property.
Right.
You have a compensation agreement, perhaps, but maybe the compensation agreement that the buyer's broker and the listing broker have negotiated, maybe that's not fully financially satisfying the buyer or the buyer's broker. Why?
Okay.
If the buyer has a buyer-broker agreement requiring the buyer to pay X amount of dollars to their agent,
Right.
and the agent's only been able to negotiate a compensation agreement with Y amount of dollars, Y being less than X, there's still a gap.
Right.
Meaning the buyer still has to come with money to pay their buyer broker closing. That would be an optional time to include Addendum or Rider FF, because now you can make up that difference.
Okay.
Now you can ask the seller, we've previously negotiated a buyer broker agreement, that's done. We've previously negotiated a compensation agreement, that's done. But there's a shortfall between the buyer broker agreement and the compensation agreement, and Mr. Seller, we'd like you to take care of that vis-a-vis a credit to the buyer, so the buyer has those dollars to pay their buyer broker at closing.
Okay, makes sense. So how does the Rider FF interact with the buyer-broker agreement, and what responsibilities exist before an offer is even written?
Well, before you even show property, you have to have a buyer-broker agreement.
Right.
So no doubt you're going to have a buyer-broker agreement before you write an offer, because it's presumed you will have shown that property either in person or virtually. So the buyer-broker agreement is step number one. When you're ready to make an offer and you discuss the listing price of a property with your buyer, and you show the buyer comps, and you help the buyer structure a compelling offer that is within their budget, that's the time to go over with your buyer all of their anticipated and projected closing costs. There could be doc stamps, intangibles, appraisal fees, home inspection fees, and of course, the buyer-broker compensation that is in the buyer-broker agreement.
Yeah.
So Addendum FF should be introduced at that time to ask your buyer, are you prepared to pay me the full compensation as we previously negotiated? Would you like me to negotiate with the seller and the listing agent through the listing agent for any compensation using the compensation agreement? Or would you like your purchase offer conditioned upon and contingent upon Rider FF, which is the compensation override, which would come from the seller through a credit to the buyer, so the buyer has those dollars to pay their agent.
And so the rider says it doesn't modify the buyer-broker agreement, which we kind of just said, but why is the language so important for realtors to understand?
Rule number one as of August 17, 2024, commissions are always negotiable.
Right.
There is no fixed commission. You can charge this, this, or this. You set the number, and you negotiate that with your customer to make sure everyone's satisfied that the amounts they're paying are fair compensation for the services they are receiving.
Yeah.
Rider FF gives you leverage. Oftentimes, when you present a buyer during your buyer consultation with that initial engagement agreement, which is the buyer-broker agreement, it's wise practice and perhaps best practice to have a Rider FF with you while you're negotiating your buyer-broker agreement and presenting it to your buyer, because you can offer them the ability to take whatever dollars they're committing to pay you in the buyer-broker agreement and tell them those dollars will be repeated in the purchase contract using Rider FF, which means you are shifting the financial obligation of that compensation from the buyer who's agreeing to pay it to you in the buyer-broker agreement over to the seller of any future property they wish to purchase. So I tell agents all the time that when you do your buyer-broker presentation and you do your buyer consultation, working with the customer, getting them engaged, wanting to hire you and engage you, have a Rider FF with you so you can show them how the buyer-broker agreement is their formal contract in hiring you, but Rider FF allows you to deflect the compensation they're paying from the buyer-broker agreement into the purchase contract, making it an actual contingency.
So let's talk about enforcement. Because if a buyer ultimately works with another broker or doesn't honor the buyer-broker agreement, what role does the brokerage play, and how should agents be thinking of enforcing not just the buyer-broker agreement, but the addendum as well?
Great question. First of all, the entire reason we have written agreements, fundamentally, is so that all the parties to a written agreement know what their obligations are.
Right.
What's expected of you, what's expected of me, what exchange of dollars exist, what are the terms of our arrangement, and also what happens if the relationship goes south. Why not just do deals on a handshake if we don't need to specify all the terms of the deal in a written document? That's where the buyer-broker agreement comes in. Now, realtors have to remember that a customer is actually hiring their company, not them.
Yeah.
They're engaging the brokerage company. So if you work at XYZ Realty, remember that buyer-broker agreement they're signing is with XYZ Realty.
Yeah.
You may be an associate or even a broker associate with XYZ Realty, but they're hiring the company the same way in a listing agreement, they're listing with a brokerage, not with a person.
Yeah.
Now, we understand the relationship is with the person. The rapport is with the person.
Yeah.
Most all the communications with the person, but the contract's with the company. So when it comes to enforcement, if anyone violates agreement, to your question, a buyer violates an agreement, did they violate the terms of the buyer-broker agreement that were negotiated?
Right.
Have they been put on notice that there's a violation? Most people don't intend to go against what they've agreed.
Right.
Some people have accidents, some people forget, some people have mistakes, but most people don't have nefarious intentions up front. So let them know, Mr. Buyer, Mrs. Buyer, you didn't follow the terms of our agreement, and here's why. We need to come up with a resolution to right the ship and put the relationship back on track. And I think you'll find with open communication and dialogue, most customers will be amenable to that. If you're not getting reasonable communication, or if you're not able to negotiate a solution amicably, always involve your broker right away.
Yeah.
Because your broker is the broker for the company. They're ultimately responsible. And consult with your broker as to what the broker's policies are. How do we handle defaulted contracts in our company? Hopefully you know that from before you're actually in a defaulted situation. Know everything up front. And your broker will guide you on their company policies and practices on how they handle it. Some brokers will say, I don't want to enforce agreements. I don't want a black eye in my reputation. I don't want to be in the newspaper. I don't want a negative review on Zillow or Realtor.com or on Facebook. Other brokers will say, you're entitled to that money, the company's entitled to that money, we need to enforce it. Oftentimes the broker will pick up the phone or send an email or a letter trying to resolve it. And unfortunately, if things go beyond that, sometimes attorneys have to be engaged, and sometimes litigation will ensue for enforcement. In the state of Florida, where everyone at the conference practices and where all these addendums are created and operated, the court system likes written agreements, and the court systems do favor written agreements. The court systems do not love handshakes or backdoor agreements. So if you do have to go to litigation, the judge will be pleased that the relationship's on paper. How they rule depends upon your case.
Yes, absolutely. So finally, what's the difference between FF and GG? Why would you use one or the other?
FF is if you want a solution. GG is if you're open to a problem. Here's why.
Okay.
With Addendum FF, the purchase contract is stipulated and conditioned upon the seller giving the buyer a credit. It's simple, it's easy to understand. I want you to pressure wash my driveway, I'd like you to leave the big screen TV in the living room, and I'd like you to pay my realtor's commission through a credit. That's simple. GG says something very different, and this is why I discourage the use of GG. It's available, it's in our toolbox. The reason I'm uncomfortable with it and I discourage it is because GG says we, the realtors, are rushing to consummate a purchase contract between a buyer and a seller. And we are so frantic and we're so in a rush to create that purchase contract that we're not going to worry about any exchange of dollars through a commission compensation agreement at this time. However, during the first few days of our pending period, once that purchase contract is executed, we'll work out those details. No, my friends, those details need to be worked out up front. It's like a marriage. Are we going to have kids, Tracy, or not? We're not going to discuss it 5 years into the marriage. I want kids. I need to know up front, do you want kids? We're not just going to figure it out. The reason it's a problem is because if the buyer and the seller are in a fully executed contract and the seller's happy to sell and the buyer's happy to buy, GG says this purchase contract is contingent on the two outside realtors hammering out a compensation agreement. And if they don't, this purchase contract can be terminated.
Yeah.
I couldn't imagine in my wildest dreams calling my buyer 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 days into their contract where they're on pace to buy their dream home to say, bad news, your dream home can't be purchased because the other realtor and I are being stubborn and we can't work out our compensation.
Yeah.
I couldn't live with myself. And I think it creates potential conflict and perhaps some animosity. It certainly creates some really unpleasant online reviews about that realtor.
Yeah.
So work out those issues up front so everything's on the table. Relationships in business and personally always go better when everything's on the table. We speak with candor, we speak with honesty, we speak with integrity, we speak from the heart, and we lay out the deal in clear, undocumented paperwork.
I love it. Hope that clears up a lot of confusion about the rider. Thanks so much, Ben, for joining me on live today.
This was such a privilege, Tracy. Thank you so much for having me.
Thank you.